At our 10th anniversary dinner, I stepped out onto the balcony just to breathe for a moment. Inside, everyone was laughing. Glasses were clinking. Someone had just started talking about how lucky Mark and I were to have such a perfect marriage. But as I reached for the balcony railing, I heard my husband's voice through the half-open door. Quiet. Controlled. Just put it in her drink. After tonight, the money becomes mine. For a moment, my mind refused to understand the words. My husband. Mark. The man I had spent 10 years trusting with my life. I slowly turned toward the door, afraid even the sound of my breath might give me away. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. She'll drink the champagne. She always does. My hands tightened around the railing, because in that moment I understood something terrifying. If I walked back to that table and drank what was waiting for me, I might not live long enough to see the end of our anniversary dinner. Before I continue, I'm really glad you're here listening to this story. If you enjoy intense, real-life dramatic stories like this one, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. Earlier that evening, everything looked perfect. From the outside, it was the kind of celebration people imagine when they think about a successful marriage. The rooftop restaurant overlooked the dark waters of the Seattle waterfront, and the city lights shimmered across the bay like scattered glass. Our table stood close to the railing so the guests could see the view. Someone from the staff had arranged white roses in a low crystal vase at the center of the table. Their scent mixed with the faint smell of the ocean drifting up from the harbor below. Soft jazz played somewhere behind us. Not loud enough to interrupt conversation, just enough to fill the quiet spaces between voices. Mark had organized the entire evening himself. That alone should have surprised me. He was not usually the kind of man who cared about decorations or dinner details. Yet that night everything had been planned with careful precision. The guest list, the menu, even the champagne. When we arrived, the restaurant manager personally greeted us at the entrance and congratulated us on 10 years of marriage. Your husband arranged something very special tonight, he said with a polite smile. I remember glancing at Mark then. He looked pleased with himself in a quiet way, the way he often did when a business deal went exactly as he expected. Throughout the evening, people kept repeating the same thing. You two look like the perfect couple. One of Mark's partners raised his glass and laughed. 10 years. These days that's practically a lifetime. Everyone around the table nodded in agreement. Mark smiled modestly and placed his hand lightly over mine, a small gesture that seemed affectionate to anyone watching. And I suppose I believed it too. That morning, before we left the house, I had stood in front of the bedroom mirror adjusting the deep blue dress I had chosen for the evening. It wasn't new, but it was the dress Mark once told me made my eyes look brighter. As I fastened the small silver clasp behind my neck, I saw his reflection appear in the mirror behind me. He leaned against the doorway, adjusting the cuff of his watch. For a moment he simply watched me. Then he stepped forward and kissed my cheek. Tonight is going to be special, he said quietly. I smiled at the time. I thought he meant romance. I thought he meant celebration. I thought he meant 10 years of shared life. When we arrived at the restaurant later that evening, our guests were already gathering around the table. Emma had been among the first to arrive. My younger sister always had a way of lighting up a room without even trying. She greeted everyone warmly, laughing easily as she took her seat beside one of Mark's associates. Seeing her there had made me feel relieved. For some reason, having Emma present made the evening feel more real, more grounded. Mark's world, his business partners, his investors, his polished friends, often felt slightly distant from my own. But Emma belonged to my life before all of that. She knew the years when everything had been uncertain, the years before Mark. Throughout the dinner, waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying plates and wine bottles. Conversations drifted across the group. Business stories, travel plans, jokes about aging and marriage. Mark played the perfect host. He laughed when expected. He introduced guests to one another. He even stood briefly to thank everyone for coming. 10 years ago, he said, raising his glass, I made the best decision of my life. Everyone applauded softly. I remember feeling a quiet warmth in my chest as I looked around the table. It seemed like a perfect evening, a perfect celebration. And perhaps that was the strangest part of everything that followed. 'Cause just a few minutes later, I stepped out onto the balcony for some fresh air. And I heard my husband calmly discussing how he planned to kill me. Standing on that balcony, I forced myself not to move. The night air coming off the Seattle waterfront was cool, damp, and sharp enough to sting the inside of my nose, but my palms were already wet against the iron railing. Below me, the harbor glittered with scattered reflections from ferries and restaurant lights, and somewhere far off I could hear the low horn of a boat passing through the dark. Inside, our anniversary dinner continued as if nothing in the world were wrong. Soft music, laughter, the clink of silverware against plates. And behind the half-open balcony door, my husband's voice. Low, controlled, practical. Don't worry, Mark said into the phone. Everything is already prepared. My body went cold so quickly it felt unnatural, as if all the warmth had been pulled out of me in a single breath. I leaned slightly toward the door, terrified that even the faint scrape of my shoe might give me away. For one impossible second I still wanted to believe there was another explanation. A misunderstanding, a cruel coincidence, a conversation about someone else. But then he spoke again. She'll drink the champagne, he said. She always does. The words did not strike me all at once. They sank in slowly, heavily, like stones dropping through dark water. Champagne. Not wine. Not dinner. Not some vague threat I could later convince myself I had imagined. Champagne. Specific. Chosen. Planned. At that exact moment, one of the waiters moved into view through the glass door, carrying a silver tray. 2 champagne flutes stood on it, their thin stems catching the warm gold light of the restaurant. The glasses looked beautiful from where I stood. Elegant. Delicate. Harmless. He placed them carefully at our seats. Mine. And Mark's. I stared at those glasses so hard that the rest of the room seemed to fade around them. My seat looked suddenly unfamiliar. Almost theatrical, as if it had been arranged for a scene in a play. The folded linen napkin, the polished silverware, the white roses in the crystal vase. Every detail appeared too precise now, too intentional. I felt the first true wave of fear then. Not the fear of hearing something terrible, the fear of understanding it. If Mark had arranged for something to be put into my drink, then the danger was no longer abstract. It was already waiting for me at the table. Inside, Emma was laughing at something one of the guests had said. She had no idea. None of them did. Mark's business partners were talking comfortably, leaning back in their chairs, one man absently checking his watch, another glancing out toward the harbor where fireworks crews were preparing barges for the later show. The whole room was full of ordinary gestures. And suddenly every one of them felt unreal. Because I was standing only a few feet away from a man I had shared a home with for 10 years. And I was listening to him calmly discuss the moment he expected me to die. After tonight, Mark murmured, everything transfers automatically. There it was. The money. Of course it was the money. My throat tightened. Years earlier, after our parents died, the small inheritance they left had been split between Emma and me, but mine had grown over time because I had been cautious. Careful. I invested conservatively, listened to advisors, avoided unnecessary risks. Mark used to joke that I treated money the way some women treated family heirlooms. Maybe he had not been joking at all. Legally, most of it remained in my name. If I died, much of it would pass to him. The realization spread through me with brutal clarity. This dinner had never been about romance. It had never been about memory or gratitude or love. It was an event with witnesses. Polished public setting. The perfect stage for a tragedy that could be dismissed as sudden illness, heart failure, an allergic reaction, anything but murder. My mouth went dry. I could almost see it unfold the way he must have imagined it. The toast. The sip. A moment of confusion. My body failing in front of guests too shocked to question what had happened until it was too late. And Mark, the grieving husband, left behind to inherit everything. For 1 second my body wanted only one thing: run. Leave the balcony. Take the elevator down. Get into the street. Call the police from somewhere far away. But I did not move. I do not say that because I was brave. I was not brave in that moment. I was terrified. I was so frightened that I could feel each beat of my heart in my throat, in my wrists, even behind my eyes. But underneath that terror, something else rose quietly. a kind of stillness. A cold, practical part of me that understood one simple truth. If Mark believed I knew nothing, then I still had one advantage. The advantage of surprise. I forced myself to breathe more slowly and look through the door again, this time trying to notice everything. Where Mark stood. Where the waiter had left the glasses. How close Emma was to my seat. Who might be watching? What might happen if I refused the toast or spilled the drink or suddenly left? No option felt safe. Refusing publicly would alert Mark that I knew something. Leaving abruptly might make him follow me before I had time to think. Accusing him without proof, in the middle of a crowded dinner, could make me sound hysterical. And hysteria, I knew, is one of the easiest ways for a woman to lose control of a room. Inside, Mark let out a short breath, as if the call were almost over. Yes, he said quietly. Tonight it ends. The words entered me like ice. Tonight it ends. Not someday. Not eventually. Not in theory. Tonight. I heard the faint click of his phone closing. Then silence. My whole body stiffened. His footsteps began to move toward the balcony door. For one violent instant, panic flashed through me. I straightened too quickly, then forced myself to turn back toward the water as if I had been admiring the view all along. I placed both hands on the railing and tried to arrange my face into something calm, something ordinary, something that would not betray the fact that my husband had just discussed murdering me a few feet behind my back. The balcony door opened. I did not turn immediately. Hey, Mark said. His voice had changed completely. Warm, easy, familiar. That frightened me more than the whisper on the phone, because it reminded me how practiced he was. I turned slowly and looked at him. He smiled the same smile I had seen 1,000 times across breakfast tables and dinner parties and holiday photographs. His tie was still perfectly straight. His expression was relaxed. His eyes showed no trace of alarm. Here you are, he said lightly. I was wondering where you went. Just needed some air. I managed. Even to my own ears, my voice sounded thin. Mark stepped beside me and rested his forearms on the railing, close enough that I could smell his cologne. It was the same expensive one he wore on important occasions, cedarwood and something dark underneath. Usually I associated that scent with formal dinners, charity events, evenings when we were meant to look polished and successful. Now it made my stomach turn. He looked out over the harbor as if he had not a care in the world. Beautiful night, he said. I nodded because I could think of nothing else to do. Below us, the water moved in long black folds beneath the reflected city lights. Somewhere inside the restaurant, someone called Mark's name and laughed. The music drifted faintly onto the balcony. Everything about the scene should have felt romantic. Instead, it felt like standing beside a stranger at the edge of something fatal. Mark turned his head toward the table inside and smiled. They just brought the champagne, he said. Everyone's waiting for the toast. For a second I thought my knees might give way. He said it so casually, so naturally, as if it were an ordinary sentence, as if the words did not conceal a trap. I looked past him into the restaurant. The 2 glasses were still there, untouched, gleaming beneath the warm light. One in front of my plate, one in front of his. Waiting. My pulse hammered so hard I thought he must surely hear it. But if he did, he gave no sign. Instead, he placed a gentle hand at the small of my back, a gesture any observer would have interpreted as affectionate, even protective. That touch nearly made me flinch. Come on, he said softly. Let's not keep everyone waiting. And in that moment I understood the full horror of my situation. The drink waiting at that table could kill me. The man guiding me toward it was my husband, and whatever I chose to do next, I had to do it before the toast. My hands were shaking so badly that I tightened my grip on the balcony railing to steady myself. For a few seconds I simply stood there beside Mark, staring down at the dark water below the restaurant. The harbor lights trembled across the surface like broken glass, and I tried to slow my breathing before he could notice anything strange in my voice. If Mark suspected that I had heard him, everything could change in an instant. So I forced my shoulders to relax. I forced myself to smile faintly when he looked at me. Then I followed his gaze back through the glass door. Inside, our guests were still talking comfortably around the table. One of the waiters was pouring water for Emma, who leaned forward in her chair, laughing at something one of Mark's partners had said. Seeing her there sent a strange wave of emotion through me. Emma had always been easy to spot in a crowd. Even as a child, she had a natural warmth about her, a way of making people feel comfortable within minutes of meeting her. That night she looked exactly the same as she always had. Carefree, trusting, completely unaware that her sister might be walking straight into a trap. And as I watched her laughing across the table, something inside me shifted. Because Emma had been the reason my life changed years ago. Seeing her sitting there pulled my thoughts suddenly backward, away from the balcony, away from the champagne glasses waiting on the table. Back to a time when everything in my life looked completely different. Back to the year our parents died. The accident happened on a rainy highway outside Tacoma. I still remember the phone call from the hospital in the middle of the night, the way the doctor's voice sounded overly calm, as if he had delivered the same terrible news many times before. Emma was only 19 then, still in college, still convinced that life would unfold gently in front of her, the way it does for people who have never yet faced real loss. When our parents were gone, everything changed overnight. The house became my responsibility. The bills, the paperwork, the endless phone calls with insurance companies and lawyers. I was only 26. But suddenly every decision seemed to rest on my shoulders. Emma tried to help where she could, but she was still young, still studying, still trying to understand a world that had suddenly become colder and more uncertain. So I did what older sisters often do. I stepped forward. I worked longer hours. I sold my small car and used public transportation so Emma could keep driving to school. I learned how to stretch every dollar until it almost hurt. At night I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by documents, tax forms, loan papers, letters from the bank, trying to build some kind of stability out of the chaos our parents had left behind. It was exhausting, lonely, and sometimes frightening, because for the first time in my life I understood how fragile security really is. And it was during that exact period when my life felt the most unstable that Mark entered it. I met him at a charity event in Portland. At the time I almost hadn't gone. I was tired from work and distracted by everything happening at home, but a colleague convinced me it would be good to get out for a few hours. Mark noticed me almost immediately. He was charming in a quiet way, confident without appearing arrogant, attentive without seeming intrusive. He asked thoughtful questions about my work, about Emma, about how I had managed everything after losing our parents. Most people avoided those subjects because they didn't know what to say. Mark listened carefully. And for the first time in months, I felt as if someone understood how heavy my life had become. Looking back now, I realize how easily trust can grow when someone arrives at exactly the moment you feel overwhelmed. Mark offered help when I needed it most. He helped me organize financial paperwork related to the inheritance. He explained investment options I had never considered. He spoke calmly about long-term planning, about stability, about building something secure for the future. At the time it felt like a lifeline. For a while I truly believed he had entered our lives to help us. But Emma noticed something long before I did. Even in those early months she seemed uneasy around him. At first I assumed she was simply protective. After all, she had just lost our parents. It made sense that she might worry about the man who suddenly appeared beside her older sister. One evening after Mark had left the house, Emma stood quietly in the kitchen doorway watching me wash dishes. "I don't trust him," she said. Her voice wasn't angry, just certain. I remember laughing softly and drying my hands with a towel. "Emma," I told her gently, "you're just being cautious." At the time I thought she was mistaken. But standing on that balcony years later, listening to Mark invite me back to a table where my drink might already be poisoned, I realized something painful. Emma had seen the danger long before I ever did. Emma's words stayed with me for a few days after that conversation. I don't trust him. At the time I tried to dismiss it as the instinctive suspicion younger siblings sometimes feel toward the person who suddenly becomes important in an older sister's life. Emma had always been protective of me in her own quiet way, even when she was still a teenager. So I brushed the comment aside. I told myself she simply needed time to get used to Mark. And in the beginning, Mark made it very easy to believe in him. He seemed to appear at exactly the moments when things felt most overwhelming. When the bank paperwork from our parents' estate became confusing, he offered to sit down with me and go through every document one by one. When I mentioned worrying about Emma's college tuition, he calmly explained different ways to structure the inheritance so that her education would be secure. He never pushed, never demanded. He simply offered advice with the confidence of someone who understood money far better than I did. At the time, that confidence felt comforting. I was exhausted from trying to carry everything alone. So little by little, I began to rely on him. Mark told people he owned a growing investment company, and from everything I could see, it seemed believable. He dressed well, spoke with authority, and moved easily among people who talked about markets, portfolios, and corporate deals. When we went to events together, other business owners treated him with a kind of respectful familiarity. Looking back now, I realize how much appearances can hide. But at the time, everything about him seemed solid, reliable, safe. For Emma and me, those were powerful words. Within a year, Mark had become a regular part of our lives. He joined us for family dinners, helped with repairs around the house, and sometimes surprised Emma with small gifts when she returned from exams. To anyone watching from the outside, he looked like a man stepping naturally into a supportive role. But Emma never warmed to him the way I expected. She was always polite, always respectful. Yet something about her behavior remained distant whenever Mark was present. I noticed it most during quiet moments. When Mark spoke, Emma listened carefully, but her eyes often lingered on him a second longer than normal, as if she were studying something she could not quite explain. Once, after he left the house late one evening, she said quietly from across the living room, "Have you ever checked the things he tells you?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable. "I don't know. It's just a feeling." Feelings. At the time I thought that was all it was. A vague discomfort that would fade with time. And for several years, life continued in a way that seemed almost peaceful. Mark and I married 2 years after we met. Emma finished college. We moved into a beautiful house overlooking a quiet neighborhood where the streets were lined with tall trees and white fences. From the outside, our lives appeared stable, successful, comfortable. But over the years, small things began to appear, little details that at first seemed too insignificant to question. Strange phone calls late at night that Mark would answer in another room. Business trips that appeared suddenly on his schedule, sometimes lasting longer than he originally explained. Occasional tension in his voice when he thought no one was listening. Once our neighbor mentioned seeing Mark outside a downtown bar arguing with a man about money. Probably business, I told myself. Another time I noticed funds moving between accounts in ways I didn't fully understand. Mark explained it away easily. "Just investment transfers," he said with a reassuring smile. I wanted to believe him, so I did. Years passed like that. Small warning signs appearing quietly and disappearing just as quickly. Each one easy to ignore if you preferred comfort over suspicion. And I suppose I did. Because life with Mark looked successful from the outside. The house, the dinner parties, the polished circle of business associates. It all seemed to confirm the story I had chosen to believe. Until the night of our 10th anniversary. Until the moment I stood on that balcony listening to my husband calmly explain how I would drink the champagne waiting at our table. And suddenly every small warning Emma had ever given me returned with painful clarity. Because standing there, only a few steps away from the celebration inside, I finally understood something that should have been obvious years earlier. Emma had never been paranoid. She had simply been paying attention. Standing beside Mark on that balcony, all of those memories rushed through my mind in a single overwhelming wave. Emma's quiet warning, the strange late-night phone calls, the tension in Mark's voice when he thought no one was listening. All the small moments I had explained away because trusting my husband felt easier than questioning him. But now the truth stood right in front of me. The champagne waiting at our table might already be poisoned, and Mark was calmly guiding me back inside to drink it. "Come on," he said softly, placing his hand at the small of my back. "Everyone's waiting." The touch felt almost gentle, almost loving. That frightened me more than anything he had said on the phone. Because it reminded me how easily someone can hide cruelty behind ordinary gestures. I forced myself to nod. If I refused too quickly, if I suddenly looked nervous or suspicious, Mark might realize something had changed. And the moment he realized that, I would lose the only advantage I had left. He still believed I knew nothing. So I walked back inside with him. The warm light of the restaurant wrapped around us again. Conversations resumed around the table, and the soft jazz music continued drifting through the room as if nothing had happened. The smell of grilled seafood and wine filled the air. To anyone watching, the evening still looked perfect. But to me, every sound now carried an edge of danger. "There they are," one of Mark's partners said cheerfully as we approached the table. "Thought you two had run away already." Everyone laughed. Emma looked up at me with a small smile. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "Just needed some air," I replied. My voice sounded calm, which surprised even me. Inside, my heart was pounding so hard that I could feel every pulse in my throat. Then I saw them. The champagne glasses. 2 tall flutes stood in front of our plates, glowing faintly under the warm restaurant lights. Tiny streams of bubbles floated lazily toward the surface of the pale gold liquid. They looked beautiful, elegant, completely harmless. But now I could barely look at them without feeling sick. For a brief moment I imagined simply knocking the glass over, pretending it had slipped from my hand. But that would draw attention. Too much attention. Mark might realize something was wrong, and once he realized that, he could change his plan. So instead I sat down slowly. Mark took his seat beside me. The waiter appeared almost immediately, adjusting the glasses with professional precision. "Champagne for the anniversary toast," he said politely. The glass stood less than 6 inches from my hand. All I had to do was lift it, take one sip, and whatever Mark had arranged would begin. I glanced sideways at him. He looked perfectly relaxed, confident, almost pleased. His expression carried the quiet satisfaction of someone whose plan was unfolding exactly as expected. And suddenly a single thought formed in my mind, sharp and clear. If Mark expected me to drink that champagne, then he had already decided which glass belonged to me. But he had made one mistake. He believed I had no reason to suspect him. At that moment, a sudden burst of light exploded across the windows behind us. The first fireworks over the harbor. Several guests turned toward the view immediately. "Look," someone said. Bright colors reflected across the dark water outside as another explosion followed the first. The entire table shifted toward the window. For a few seconds, everyone's attention moved away from the table. That moment was all I needed. While the others watched the fireworks, I reached forward casually as if adjusting the glasses to make space on the table. My fingers moved quickly, quietly, without hesitation. I switched them. The glass that had been placed in front of me now sat directly in front of Mark, and the one that had been his now stood before me. The movement took less than 2 seconds. No one noticed. Not the guests. Not the waiter. Not even Mark. When the fireworks faded, the attention of the table slowly returned. Mark reached forward and picked up the glass now standing in front of him. "To 10 wonderful years," he said with a confident smile. Everyone lifted their glasses. I did the same. But inside, something cold and steady had settled in my chest. Because if Mark had truly poisoned that drink, then the man about to swallow it was no longer me. For a moment, everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to. Our guests raised their glasses. The warm restaurant lights shimmered through the pale gold champagne, and someone at the far end of the table laughed softly as the last fireworks faded across the dark Seattle harbor outside the windows. Mark lifted his glass with confidence. "To 10 wonderful years," he said. Crystal chimed gently as glasses touched. I raised mine too, letting the rim brush my lips just long enough to make the gesture look natural. The champagne touched my tongue for only a second before I lowered the glass again. Mark, however, drank. Not just a polite sip. He tilted the glass and swallowed a full mouthful, then another, smiling faintly as he placed the flute back onto the table. The man looked satisfied, victorious, as if the evening had finally reached the moment he had been waiting for. For several seconds nothing happened. Conversation resumed. One of Mark's partners began describing a development project near the waterfront. Another guest leaned back in his chair and commented on how beautiful the fireworks had been. The waiter quietly refilled someone's water glass. The room returned to normal. But I kept watching Mark. And then it began. He blinked. Once. Twice. At first the movement was small enough that no one noticed. He cleared his throat and shifted slightly in his chair. You all right? One of the investors asked casually. Mark nodded. Yeah, just a little. The sentence stopped. The last word never came. He frowned slightly, as if trying to remember what he had been about to say. Emma leaned forward a little. Mark. He waved his hand dismissively. I'm fine, he said. But his voice sounded different now. Slower. Thicker. His fingers moved toward the champagne glass, but when he tried to set it down more firmly, he clipped the stem awkwardly. The flute tipped sideways. It rolled across the white tablecloth, leaving a thin line of spilled champagne behind it. Mark stared at the glass as if it had moved by itself. The table fell quiet. Mark, Emma said again. This time her voice carried real concern. He laughed suddenly. Too loudly. I told you, he said. Several people looked at him. Told us what? Someone asked. Mark leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes unfocused. I told them it would work, he said. A puzzled silence spread across the table. One of the investors frowned. What would work? Mark's gaze drifted slowly across the group. Then it landed on me. For a brief second something flashed across his face. Recognition. Then confusion. Then something darker. But whatever realization was forming inside him was already slipping out of his control. The money, he said loudly. It all becomes mine tonight. Emma's expression froze. What money? Mark laughed again. The sound was uneven now. Her money, he said, gesturing clumsily in my direction. I told them, after the champagne. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Someone at the table lowered their glass slowly. What do you mean after the champagne? One of the men asked. Mark leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table as if the room had suddenly begun to spin around him. His breathing had changed. Shorter. Faster. The poison, he muttered. That's all it needed, just one drink. Emma's face turned completely pale. Did he just say poison? Someone whispered. A chair scraped loudly as one of the guests stood up. Another guest was already pulling out their phone. Should we call someone? Mark's eyes moved across the table again, but now they seemed unfocused, drifting from face to face without recognition. The accounts, he mumbled. The inheritance transfers. Automatically. His words were no longer sentences, just fragments. After tonight, no one would suspect. Several nearby tables in the restaurant had turned toward us now. People were watching, whispering. A man from another table stepped closer, trying to understand what was happening. Is he drunk? Someone asked quietly. No, another guest said. This isn't alcohol. Mark suddenly tried to push himself out of his chair. The movement was clumsy. His hand slipped on the tablecloth. For a second it looked like he might fall forward. One of his partners grabbed his shoulder to steady him. Mark, the man said sharply. What exactly did you put in that drink? The words cut through the noise around the table. Mark froze. His eyes dropped slowly to the champagne glass lying on its side. Then they lifted again and locked onto me. For a long silent second he simply stared. Then realization exploded across his face. His breathing stopped. His pupils widened. You, he whispered. But he never finished the sentence. Because at that exact moment his balance failed completely. His chair scraped violently across the floor as his body lurched sideways. A wave of shocked voices spread through the restaurant. Call an ambulance. Emma stood up so quickly her chair tipped backward. Mark. Several guests rushed toward him as he collapsed heavily against the table, knocking over plates and glasses. The waiter backed away in panic. Phones were already raised. Someone near the window began recording. And in the middle of that chaos, surrounded by witnesses, cameras, and horrified guests, my husband finally understood the terrible truth. The drink meant for me was the one he had just swallowed. For a second no one moved. It was as if the entire restaurant had forgotten how. Mark's body slumped awkwardly against the table, one arm dragging a plate to the floor as crystal shattered beneath him. The white tablecloth, so carefully arranged only minutes earlier, was soaked now with champagne, water, and spilled sauce. One of the candles tipped sideways, and wax began to drip onto the linen in small pale drops. Then the noise came all at once. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. Someone near the window screamed. A waiter rushed forward, then stopped abruptly, unsure whether to touch Mark or back away from him. One of his business partners grabbed his shoulder and tried to straighten him in the chair, but Mark's body was no longer responding properly. His head tilted at a strange angle, and when he tried to speak, all that came out was a low, broken sound. "Call an ambulance," a woman shouted from another table. "I already did," someone answered. Emma stood frozen for one horrible second, staring at Mark as if she could not make sense of what she had just heard him confess. Then she turned to me so suddenly that her chair nearly fell behind her. Her eyes filled instantly, not only with fear, with understanding. She knew, or at least she knew enough. I could see it in the way her face changed as she looked from Mark to the overturned glass, then back to me. "Oh my God," she whispered. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My hands were cold, but inside that cold there was another feeling rising slowly. Something heavier than shock, quieter than panic. Relief. Not joy. Never joy. There is nothing joyful in watching a human being collapse in front of you, even when that human being has just tried to kill you. But relief, yes. As I was still alive. One of the investors stepped back from the table, his face pale with disgust. "Did he say poison?" He asked no one in particular. Another man, younger and sharper, already had his phone in his hand. "I recorded part of it," he said. "I got the part about the money." Those words seemed to pass through the table like electricity. The money, the inheritance, the champagne. Everything Mark had tried so carefully to hide was now hanging in the air in front of witnesses. Emma finally moved to my side. Her hand gripped my arm so tightly it almost hurt. "Are you all right?" she asked. Her voice broke on the last word. I looked at her and nodded once, though I wasn't sure it was true. My body felt strangely distant from me, as if I had stepped just outside myself and was watching the scene unfold from somewhere colder and calmer. Across from us, Mark tried again to lift his head. His lips moved. First no one could understand him. Then he forced out a few uneven words. "She switched." His eyes found mine again, and for the first time that night there was no confidence in them, only terror. He knew. He knew exactly what had happened, but by then it no longer mattered. The room had already heard enough. Within minutes, the restaurant manager arrived, followed by 2 security staff members who began asking guests to step back and clear the area. The music had been turned off. Without it, the room felt exposed, every whisper and every clink of broken glass suddenly too loud. The paramedics came quickly. Seattle traffic must have been merciful that night, because it seemed like only a few breaths had passed before the elevator doors opened and 2 men in dark uniforms crossed the restaurant floor with emergency bags in their hands. They knelt beside Mark immediately. Questions were asked. What had he consumed? How much had he drunk? Did anyone know whether he had taken medication? No one answered clearly at first. Then one of Mark's partners, still pale and visibly shaken, said the words out loud. He said the drink was poisoned. Silence followed that sentence. Even the paramedic paused for half a beat before continuing his work. Mark was lifted from the chair and placed onto a stretcher. By then his speech had dissolved into confused sounds, and his body seemed to jerk in uneven waves. I watched them fasten the straps across his chest and legs. I thought I might feel triumph, vindication, anger. Instead I felt something more complicated and far more human. Grief. Not for the marriage I had thought I was living in. That had already died the moment I heard his voice on the balcony. No, what I grieved was the years. 10 years of trust. 10 years of shared breakfasts, holidays, ordinary evenings, plans, lies, habits, photographs, private jokes, routines. 10 years built around a man I had never truly known. As the paramedics wheeled Mark toward the elevator, he turned his head weakly in my direction. His eyes were still open, but there was no calculation left in them now. No charm. No polished confidence. Only raw fear. I held his gaze for 1 second. Then I looked away. The police arrived before the stretcher had even left the building. By then several guests were already speaking over one another, trying to explain what they had heard. One officer separated them gently and began taking statements one by one. Another asked to speak with me privately. Emma refused to leave my side. I was grateful for that. Because when the officer asked, "Ma'am, can you tell me exactly what happened tonight?" I realized that if Emma had not been standing there beside me, I might have forgotten how to speak. So I told the truth. Not all of it at once. Just enough. I told him about the balcony, about the phone call, about hearing Mark say, "Just put it in her drink," about the champagne waiting at the table. I did not mention the moment I switched the glasses until he asked directly whether Mark could have consumed the drink intended for someone else. Then I looked him in the eye and answered quietly, "Yes." He wrote that down without changing his expression. Around us, the restaurant had fallen into a stunned kind of order. Broken glass was being swept up. Staff moved in hushed voices. Guests gathered in small clusters, whispering to one another with the wide-eyed intimacy people share after witnessing something they will be talking about for years. Our anniversary dinner had ended exactly as Mark never expected. Not with applause. Not with romance. But with police lights flashing blue and red across the restaurant windows, and the sound of his secrets spilling out in public where they could never be buried again. The weeks that followed that night felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful at first. Quiet in the way a house feels after a storm has torn through it. The walls are still standing, the furniture is still there, but something fundamental has shifted. Something invisible that once held everything together has been broken. For the first few days, my phone never stopped ringing. Police investigators, lawyers, insurance representatives, journalists who somehow heard rumors about an incident at a Seattle waterfront restaurant. Most of them wanted details. Most of them wanted explanations. But the truth, once spoken aloud, was surprisingly simple. Mark had been taken to the hospital that night under police supervision. The toxicology results confirmed what several people at the dinner had already suspected. A fast-acting poison had been mixed into one of the champagne glasses. The same glass Mark drank from. Several of the guests had recorded parts of his confused confession before the paramedics arrived. His own words about the poison, the inheritance, the transfer of money, were now preserved on multiple phones. There was no way to take them back. The police searched Mark's office a few days later. They found financial records that told a story I had never fully seen during our marriage. Debts hidden through complicated transfers. Risky investments that had failed quietly behind the scenes. Loans from people whose names I had never heard before. The successful businessman I thought I had married had been losing control of his finances for years. And at some point he decided my inheritance was the solution. Emma stayed with me through most of those early weeks. She moved quietly around the house, making coffee in the mornings, answering the door when reporters tried to appear unexpectedly. Sometimes we sat together in the living room without speaking for long stretches of time. One evening, while we watched the sunset through the kitchen window, she said something that stayed with me. "I tried to tell you once." I nodded. "I know." Her voice softened. "I didn't know it would be this bad." Neither had I. But strangely, the shock of that night began to fade faster than I expected. The anger faded too. What replaced it was something much calmer. Clarity. For the first time in years, I began to see my life without Mark's influence shaping every decision around it. The house felt different. The quiet no longer felt tense. It felt open. Mark was eventually charged with attempted murder, financial fraud, and several other crimes uncovered during the investigation. His business collapsed almost immediately once the details became public. Investors withdrew their support, and several partners distanced themselves from him within days. By the time the legal process began moving forward, the man who once hosted elegant dinner parties had become someone people preferred not to mention. I attended only one hearing, not because I wanted to see him again, but because I wanted to hear the truth spoken clearly in a courtroom. When the judge read the charges aloud, I felt something inside me finally settle. The story of my marriage had ended long before that moment, but the illusion of it ended there. A few months later, Emma and I made a decision that surprised many people who knew us. We left Seattle, not because the city held painful memories, but because we both realized something important. Starting again sometimes requires distance. We moved south to San Diego, where the air felt warmer and the ocean sounded different than the cold waters of the Pacific Northwest. Emma found work quickly, and I began slowly rebuilding a routine that belonged entirely to me. Mornings became quiet walks near the water. Evenings became long conversations on the balcony, with no tension hiding behind polite smiles. There were no secrets, no hidden debts, no carefully arranged traps disguised as celebrations. Just ordinary life. Peaceful life. Sometimes people ask whether I regret switching those glasses that night. I always answer honestly, no, because in that moment I did not choose revenge. I chose survival. And for the first time in many years, that choice allowed me to live without fear. Sometimes the people we trust the most can hide the darkest intentions. For years I believed I knew the man I married. I believed that love, loyalty, and shared history meant safety. But that night taught me something I will never forget. Trust should never mean blindness. There were signs along the way, small warnings, quiet instincts, things my sister noticed long before I did. I ignored them because the life we built together looked perfect from the outside. But truth has a strange way of revealing itself, even when someone works very hard to bury it. Some names and certain details in this story have been changed to protect privacy, but the lesson behind it remains very real. Now I'm curious about something. If you were in my place and overheard a conversation like that on the balcony, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoy powerful real-life stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more stories waiting for you.